Welcome once again to Along the Rio Grande. I'm George Torok, and today we're going to be visiting with someone who's no stranger to the community college, Dr. Jere Franco, who has just finished a major book called Crossing the Pond, the Native American Effort in World War II. It deals with the role of Indians and Indian tribes in the war effort, and we want to welcome you to Along the Rio Grande today.
Well, I'm very happy to be here.
What's your background in history? How did you get interested in historic studies?
Well, I came here from Dallas. I'm a native of Dallas, and I came to UTEP to get my bachelor's and my master's in history. And because before I had, for many years, I had lived in Phoenix, Arizona as a young girl, and I went to school with Native Americans. So I had a natural interest in Native Americans, and in addition to that, I had a natural interest in World War II. So when it came time to do my master's thesis, it just seemed natural to do this particular topic, and I did it for my doctoral dissertation when I went to the University of Arizona. I received my PhD in 1990 from the University of Arizona, and I also did it for my doctoral dissertation. So this is a natural outcome of those many years of research.
So you had plenty of contact and you were familiar with the Native American population in the Southwest? And this...
I'm familiar with Native American population. I've been on a good many reservations. I've traveled a great deal in the Southwest, and I do have a lot of Native American friends. I was unable to do interviews with World War II veterans, unfortunately, for this book because of lack of funding. I could not get funding, unfortunately, to do that.
What kinds of sources did you make use of? What resources were out there for looking at the role of Native Americans in the Second World War?
There are certainly more resources than I was able to get to because, again, I could not get any funding. It didn't seem to be a very hot topic when I was applying for funding. But I do have to thank the Tigwa Indian tribe here in El Paso. They were very instrumental in pointing me to a number of resources, including a contact at the Pentagon. And he and I shared a number of articles and documents as he was doing some similar research. And we shared a lot of information over the years as we were both researching this topic.
Is this something that there has not been a lot of work on? Was it a pretty fresh area to do research in?
I was doing this research at the same time as another student, Allison Bernstein, who also published a book on the same topic. But our perspectives are quite different, and she has a perspective that I consider to be more assimilationist. And mine would be more traditional to the Native American culture. In other words, this is not the perspective that Native Americans went into the war and then wanted to assimilate into white society. In other words, it was exactly the opposite. That is my entire thesis.
In what sense?
Native Americans went into the war effort with a great deal of enthusiasm because they believed that this was a just war. It was something that they should participate in. They should give it their all. And of course, war is an honored occupation among Indians, and they do gain status from this. But at the same time, their intent was not to use this experience to leave their reservations and enter white society and turn themselves into, quote, white people.
So there was kind of a preservation of the culture and an effort to stay with that culture to some extent throughout the war
very
years.
much, very much. They went in, they were always very proudly proclaimed themselves to be Native Americans and members of their tribe, and they saw themselves as dual citizens and people who should be respected for that.
You start out the book talking a little bit about how the Nazis and the fascist movement overall tried to use the Native American population in the United States. This is something that got me interested in it right away. What was the connection? What were they trying to do there?
Well, there were actually two things they were trying to do in their relationship with the Indian tribes. One of them, of course, concerned the language. Native American languages had been used in World War I with radio operators speaking to each other in whatever their native language were. I believe the Comanches were used at that time. And of course, this baffled the enemy. They couldn't break the code. And so the Nazis knew that in the late or mid to late 30s that there would be another war. They knew that there was a very strong likelihood that Native American languages would be used again. And they literally tried to infiltrate Indian tribes by posing as anthropologists, by saying they wanted to study the cultures to see what they could learn about the tribe and the tribal languages. But of course, it's very difficult for any non-Indian to learn an Indian language. And they are hidden languages, they're not written, and so they were extremely unsuccessful in that effort. Now, on the, there was another purpose when they weren't too successful in that. They also tried to use the Indians for propaganda purposes. Now, it wasn't so much that they were trying to recruit large numbers of Indians to their cause, although they did have some far-fetched idea that perhaps they could encourage them to rise up and rebel and start to kill people in this country. Obviously, they didn't understand Native Americans at all or their relationship with this country. But they did want to, what they wanted to do was to use them as propaganda. Mm-hmm. And they wanted to make some alliances with Indians and possibly fund some of these people. They did fund some of these people. They paid them money to go around and speak because there were many Indians who were dissatisfied with the Indian Bureau. This is always the case. And when they made these alliances, now their purpose was to discredit not only the Indian Bureau but the Roosevelt administration, and to exploit the plight of the Native American, which has always been, of course, very unjust. We all know this. We know they've had centuries of some mistreatment and a lot of struggle.
They're not very successful at this, and when war breaks out, what is the response of the Native American population?
The response was that Native Americans had the highest selective service registration rate in the entire nation, and the figures ranged from a low of 99% of all eligible males to 100% at any given time.
So there was some enthusiasm for
more than enthusiasm. Native Americans served at least 10% of, sent at least 10% of their population into the war effort. And this is comparable to white numbers. So this is what any given group would send in. And this is despite the fact that they had a much higher rejection rate than whites. Whites had a 32% rejection rate. Native Americans had a 37.5% rejection rate.
And as the Roosevelt administration's getting the country ready for war, were there some concerns with having Indian populations in the service? Were there some Indian traditions that might have conflicted with military service?
Right, and Native Americans had no problem in wanting to go and serve their country and to fight. But Native Americans at this time ranged from highly sophisticated individuals who may hold master's degrees from universities to Indians who spoke only their tribal language and had actually never been off their reservation. So there was quite a range. And it was this latter group that sometimes posed a lot of perplexing problems for authorities because they would do things like refusing to have their picture taken because this is a taboo among many Indian tribes. They believe that it stills your soul. Or they would refuse to have their hair cut because, again, this was something that was sacred to their particular tribe. And authorities would be perplexed at how to deal with these people. They just didn't know what to do with them.
So this was quite a bit different situation than dealing with the average draftee or the average enlistee. There's also some legal questions raised about drafting Indians into service and registering them for service. What kind of problems were there in the 1930s and early 40s?
Well, of course, registration was affected. This is interesting that registration was actually begun in 1938 on Indian reservations, well before the government ever announced we had any war intentions. This was at the height of our isolationist policy. But the main issue that surfaced was the fact that Native Americans, as they do today, declared themselves to be sovereign nations. And they have been considered to be sovereign nations since our relations with the British government. We have considered them to be, in a sense, foreign nations, and we make treaties with these tribes. And as such, they hold dual citizenship. Now, it's understandable that you can take a legal leap here and say, does the government then have the power to draft these people? And while most Native Americans did not object to the draft, a few brought up this issue because it was a constitutional legal issue, and they wanted to test it in the courts. And it was tested at the federal level.
And what was the result of those tests?
Well,
and
ex parte
decisions?
Green, Judge Jere Franco did declare that, and it was reluctantly noted, that Indian tribes, although they did hold this special status, were subject to the draft because of the particular circumstances. During war, they were subject to the draft.
Now, you say that when Native Americans went to fight the white man's war, they went to war on their own terms. Exactly does that mean?
Well, I like to point out here that fighting the white man's war is from my friend Professor Tom Home at the University of Arizona. This is his phrase that he has used, and he and I have shared on a lot of ideas over the years. But they went on their own terms. They went, as I said already, very proud to be Native Americans and First Americans and declaring to be Indians. And they always reminded people of their particular status. They were fighting a war because they felt it was just, but they weren't necessarily saying that we agree with all policies of the United States. They weren't, this was not a vindication of American Indian policy in any way. They still had grievances with the government in many cases. They had a lot of issues to resolve. And so when they went into this war, they were doing their duty as warriors.
And some of their tribal customs and some of their tribal practices were part of that declaration of war and part of that decision to
Yes, as a matter of fact, many Indian tribes did not believe that the war had actually begun until they declared war.
So a tribal declaration.
A tribal
of war.
declaration of war was necessary for many tribes, and in addition to that, war was not over until they had sent a peace pipe to all of the leaders. So for them, the war might be over after the United States declaration of war. And these were things that became quite popular in the media, and a lot of politicians wanted to get in on the act here, and they would ask, well, do you mind if I take the peace pipe to President Roosevelt, and personally, or in this case, President Truman, if it was after Roosevelt's death, and deliver the peace pipe to him. So it was quite popular.
Now, we think of military service as being part of the war effort, but the war effort has a very big impact on the reservation and the people that stay behind as well. What starts to change on the reservations as so many men go off to war?
Well, you see, people recruited by the hundreds of thousands, actually. We do have a figure that 25,000 served in factories, but I think that figure is low. I think it's actually higher than that because I don't think they documented the off-reservation Indians who also left to go and work.
So they go to work in the war industries.
They went to work in the war industries. They went to work on farms. They were recruited to work on the railroads. As a matter of fact, in some reservations, we can tell how many people were literally recruited. Just, any able-bodied person, man or woman, who was left behind was recruited because of school enrollment figures. And on some reservations, the school enrollment figures fell by 75%. And that is not because of delinquency. That is because the families had relocated temporarily to the cities.
So who was taking care of the reservation? Who was taking care of the reservation
a lot of the
business?
times it would be the elderly people. They were, people would get together, and for example, in a farming community, and one family would agree to take care of the farming necessities for a number of other families. And Native Americans, of course, were quite lucky in this regard because they've always had a communal lifestyle. They've always helped each other out. This is part of their culture. And it was just another one of those necessary times.
I assume that women's roles changed as well on the reservation?
Well, women's roles did change. Not only were they very often recruited to go into the white culture and to do things they had not done before. Many women, by the way, did join the WACs and the WAVES and became nurses and other auxiliary positions. But they also entered a lot of fields that hitherto that previously had been closed to them, such as some Navajo women learned silversmithing. And this had traditionally been a male occupation. And then during the war, women found the opportunity to try this new skill, and they really enjoyed it. They really liked this a lot.
The Native Americans that go off the reservation and work in these industries or work in areas outside, what kind of problems do they confront? Do they adapt well to life off of the reservation?
It was very interesting. Indians find that the further they go away from their own reservation, the less racism they encounter and the less prejudice. But they might encounter other problems as well. And obviously it's a matter of the way you're brought up in your culture. And they would go into the white workforce very often, and Native Americans traditionally follow a leader because he is a leader, because he exerts some moral influence over them, and it's a very personal relationship. And a lot of these white employers would find that on the job, if a Native American leader didn't like their boss, they wouldn't follow him. They would simply just not do what he told them to do, because he obviously had no respect from them. And so again, there was this clash of culture, and the employers would say, well, these people are being obstinate, when in fact they were behaving in the way that they had been traditionally brought up to behave.
You say that the further away from the reservation they get, the less racism. Well, how do we explain that? What is the problem?
Well, I do believe that probably with any culture, the closer you are to another culture, in many cases it breeds a lack of respect. And people would be more inclined in a surrounding community to view these neighbors with some suspicion. You know, they're a little different. They have different customs. They may, it may be a very poor reservation with all of the attendant problems. And the further away a Native American goes, particularly if he's alone, he tends to be, he or she tends to become quite acceptable, and people tend to view Native Americans as a little more exotic. And they're very, a lot of these Native Americans experienced things like people telling them, oh, I have some Indian blood. And they would be quite skeptical, of course. You know, we're talking about full-blood Native
People, for some
Americans.
reason, further away from the culture felt some affinity to it, felt some
Exactly. They
connection.
wanted to identify with this culture at that point. And Native Americans expressed a lot of disappointment at how little people knew about their culture, which is probably still true today.
As far as military service itself, what role did Native Americans play in the actual fighting of the war? Were they distinguished?
Oh,
Did they
yes, very
have
much.
certain roles?
At least 2 Native Americans won the Medal of Honor. And there were, every award that could be given simply was won by Native Americans. And before I get to the one that is best known here, I'll mention that Native Americans served in every capacity that is known. They were bomber pilots, they were medics, they worked in the clerical areas, they were in the infantry and the cavalry and the Navy. They simply cannot be categorized into one or two simple categories here, because with the exception of one all-Indian unit and one Indian unit I'm going to mention that was primarily Native American, they were not, they were integrated into the military. They were integrated into different units. They were not kept
So the situation
separate.
was different than with African Americans.
Exactly. As a matter of fact, at the beginning of the war, Commissioner John Collier was very careful to make sure that the Indians were designated white, because he knew that if they weren't, they would not be allowed to fight and to have the kind of record they wanted, because he knew what was going on at that time with the racial policies.
And most of the Indian tribes across the country participated to some degree in the war
Oh,
effort?
yes. Some of them participated to such a degree that they were actually in danger of endangering their tribal longevity, because they had sent so many young men into the war and so many were dying.
And our Tigwa population locally served in the war as
Oh,
well?
yes, we had people going into the war, and I don't know the figures there, but I know that the Tigwas have served just like other Indian tribes since the beginning as scouts and in every major war. So we would have veterans here who have good stories to tell.
Now, that one particular group that
Yeah.
you spoke of,
me
they've
mention-
gained some recognition over the years. People may not be familiar with exactly what role they played.
There are 2 groups here, and one of them that is the best known, that people mention to me most often, are the Navajo Code Talkers. And the code talkers, of course, came from the most populous Indian tribe, the Navajos. At the time, there were 50,000. They have a very unique language. Of course, all Indian languages are unique, but it was the idea of a missionary on the reservation to take their tribal language and turn it into a code. And they recruited a number of young men, and people may not know it, but the Navajo code talkers, at least initially, I'm not sure if this continued throughout the war, had to have some college experience for them to become a code talker. So these were very bright, well-educated young men. And they were also extremely, they had a lot of physical attributes as well. They were usually the best sharpshooters and the most physically adept in their units. But they were recruited by the Marines, and it was the code talkers themselves, Carl Gorman and others, who developed the code from their language. Now, first of all, Navajo itself is hard enough, but then they turned it into a code. For example, there is no name in the Indian language for tank. That's a modern word. So they used the term turtle to indicate tank. Well, when you take it another step, like this one, the Germans, I'm sorry, the Japanese in this case, were totally unable to break their code, and the Navajo code talkers have been credited with many battle victories. In other words, they're
many lives.
Exactly, and what they did was just of extreme importance, and they did receive the Congressional Medal of Honor in 1980.
So even if you were able to break the code, you wouldn't necessarily know what the code
You wouldn't know
meant.
what they were talking about still. Yeah.
And the other group that made a contribution?
The other group is less well known, and they're very, very interesting. These are the Bushmasters. Now, they were not totally Native American, but at least 20 different tribes did have people in this unique group. There were whites in this group as well, but it did have, next to the Navajo code talkers, they had the largest number of Indians in any one unit. And the Bushmasters were sent to Panama to train, and they were trained in small assault weapons and knives and hand-to-hand combat. So they were meant to do reconnaissance and basically reconnaissance involves a great deal of sneaking around and fighting. And they were especially useful in one battle in 1942, and I'm probably mispronouncing this, but the island was Araway, I believe. And in this case, the Texas cavalry was there, and they were holding, they were on the island, and they were being pinned down under a great deal of heavy fire from the Japanese. And the military sent in the Bushmasters to help them out. And so in this case, the Indians went in and rescued the cavalry.
Wow. Let's talk a little bit more about some of the other contributions that Native Americans make, because aside from being part of the workforce and being part of the military, the Indian tribes make tremendous contributions to the war effort.
Their resources were used. The Navajos contributed helium, and one source said that without that helium, they would never have been able to make a lot of the Atlantic crossings that they had to do. They used them in blimps at the time. The Blackfeet donated their oil resources. Now, they weren't donated, of course, they were purchased. However, they were purchased at a very low, below market price. And the Blackfeet almost depleted their reserves in the war effort to the detriment of the tribe. And other tribes contributed all kinds of things. They bought war bonds or held dances to raise money for war bonds to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars. The Shoshone tribe alone bought $500,000 worth of war bonds.
Let's talk a little bit about what happens to Indians after the war is over. What kinds of changes start to take place as Indian veterans serve distinguishedly in the service? The reservations make great contributions. How does that affect Indian life once the war is over?
Indians, even before the war was over, Native Americans were discussing their post-war plans. They were talking about things such as what they would do with the GI Bill, going to school, starting a business. They were talking about the fact that they could not vote. In at least 6 different states, and 2 of those states held a number of Indian tribes. That's Arizona and New Mexico. And they were discussing this, and there were some pros and cons here, but they were very aware of it. They were especially incensed. The men were that while they were in the service, they could go with their friends and they could purchase alcohol. But they knew that when they went back to their particular states, they would not be able to purchase alcohol because it was illegal in these states, in most areas, for an Indian to get a drink.
So there's
This
sort
was
of an
problem.
elements of the civil rights movement coming out of this experience in the war. What other kinds of things did they look at in that period?
They wanted to raise the standards of the reservation. They wanted to raise the economic standards, health, education. They wanted to make it a better place where they could live. And during the war, people had predicted that, and again, this is where I diverge from the earlier research that's been done. They had predicted that Native Americans would want to leave the reservations and enter white society as equals and basically forget about this reservation communal lifestyle. But instead, reservation numbers increased, populations increased at the end of the war as people did return to the reservations, and they simply wanted to make these a better place to live.
So in a sense, it made the reservation, it made tribal culture more united. It brought
I
back
think
a
it
sense
did.
of pride and a sense of spirit that may have been lacking to some degree in the 1930s. And
No,
the
I don't
focus
think
was
they
on-
ever actually lacked it in the 1930s. I don't think that was true. I don't think they've ever lacked this. But however, I do think that this was you have to put it in the context of the overall time period. And everyone coming back from the war was optimistic. Everyone thought it was going to, they could do anything because they had just made the world safe for democracy. And so why couldn't they make their own life better? I think the Native Americans were just as optimistic as any American returning. It just didn't work out the same for them.
Well, it's certainly a fascinating book, Crossing the Pond, the Native American Effort in World War II. It brings a lot of interesting issues to light, and it gives us a little bit of a understanding of what Native Americans felt after that experience and what enthusiasm or optimism they may have had for the future role of Native Americans in the United States. I want to thank you very much for
Thank
coming
you.
and visiting
Appreciate it.
with us today, and we hope to have you back again sometime on our program.
I'd be very happy to return.
And we want to thank you all for joining us as well here on Along the Rio Grande, and we hope to see you on our next program.